Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jill Kirkman, and I'm one of the academic team members of the Social Work Division from the University of Huddersfield. And I'm just sort of thinking I might have drawn the short straw going after Dr. Joseph. I'm just a bit sort of, wow, okay? Very, very powerful. And I think for me, reflecting on the powerfulness of that speech has been thinking about the day so far in terms of considering things about the prevalence of domestic abuse, thinking about the stories of the survivors, thinking about those really powerful headlines that we've seen from Dr. Joseph, and some of the attitudes of the perpetrators that Tyrone was talking about today can sometimes leave us feeling that this is so chronic and so embedded in not just Caribbean society but across the world. Certainly I've been working in domestic violence probably for the best part of 20, if not longer, years. I was a social worker in child protection for 15 and have been in academia probably for about the last 11 years. It can feel overwhelming. The statistics that we have in the UK, I have to say, are very, very similar to here. And you begin to wonder what on earth we can do about it. I did draw upon Margaret Mead that Tyrone gave at the end, the quote that it only takes a few. It only takes a few who have it in our hearts, who have a passion and a desire to make something change and to make that difference. And I feel it in here today, and that makes my heart warm because I think that we can. I'm here just really to help introduce what's coming next, which... Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jill Kirkman, and I'm one of the academic team members of the Social Work Division from the University of Huddersfield. And I'm just sort of thinking I might have drawn the short straw going after Dr. Joseph. I'm just a bit sort of, wow, okay? Very, very powerful. And I think for me, reflecting on the powerfulness of that speech has been thinking about the day so far in terms of considering things about the prevalence of domestic abuse, thinking about the stories of the survivors, thinking about those really powerful headlines that we've seen from Dr. Joseph, and some of the attitudes of the perpetrators that Tyrone was talking about today can sometimes leave us feeling that this is so chronic and so embedded in not just Caribbean society but across the world. Certainly I've been working in domestic violence probably for the best part of 20, if not longer, years. I was a social worker in child protection for 15 and have been in academia probably for about the last 11 years. It can feel overwhelming. The statistics that we have in the UK, I have to say, are very, very similar to here. And you begin to wonder what on earth we can do about it. I did draw upon Margaret Mead that Tyrone gave at the end, the quote that it only takes a few. It only takes a few who have it in our hearts, who have a passion and a desire to make something change and to make that difference. And I feel it in here today, and that makes my heart warm because I think that we can. I'm here just really to help introduce what's coming next, which is a presentation from Dave Smith, who is our computer games developer. Because obviously one of the things that we have heard about today in terms of this overwhelming problem is, okay, well, what can we begin to do about it? And obviously, as Adele Jones was saying, there has been a significant amount of work already in terms of projects, in terms of research, looking at particular issues around domestic abuse. And I think we've heard a lot about what's happening in homes for children and how domestic violence across adults impacts on the development and the attachment of children, and how that then displays itself for them in later life. Perhaps what we've not yet considered is the amount of domestic abuse and violence within adolescent relationships, so that domestic violence is becoming lower and lower and lower in terms of movement between adolescents and children. And I think some of the headlines that Dr. Joseph talked about is that we've got very young children committing violence against one another and against adults. And certainly the statistics in the UK and in North America would suggest that violence and sexual abuse in adolescent relationships is just as high as it is in the adult population. So what do we do? I think one of the things about our project is about a small intervention, but hopefully a powerful intervention. I take the point from Dr. Joseph in that this has to be a systems approach to tackling domestic abuse, but we have to start in whatever ways we can. And we in this research project are hoping to start with a program that can go out to schools and colleges, and it's a gaming intervention aimed not only just to educate children and young people, because I think the interventions that have happened so far, mainly in Northern America, which have attempted to educate adolescents around what is a healthy relationship, isn't enough. Education isn't enough. It has to have an intervention whereby we can begin to change attitudes and understanding. And therefore, what we're wanting to look at is the idea of intervening with a pro-social game that will increase empathy, pro-social skills, and emotional intelligence. In recent years, we've seen an increase of these pro-social persuasive games for young people that have begun to tackle issues, sensitive and difficult issues, that have helped young people to understand perhaps what they've been going through, but also to look at ways in which to use conflict resolution. So some of the persuasive pro-social games that are out in the general public at the moment are tackling issues such as running away from home, cancer, depression, and anxiety. And what they show is that we can help young people to be more empathetic, to be able to share and understand what's happening to them, and to seek appropriate help. Latest research suggests that pro-social games can help children and young people develop positive relationships and develop team working, and importantly, develop emotional intelligence. A pro-social context is not a new phenomenon in game, and even you can see them in the most violent of games that a lot of our children we know shouldn't be playing but have easy access to. So most violent games, there will be characters that need help, characters that need rescuing, where it's important, if you're fighting against the enemy, that you work together as a team. So it already exists in a lot of the video games that children are looking at now, and also have been developed in particular difficult and sensitive areas. The game that Dave is going to have a look at and discuss will aim to change attitudes and behaviour, build conflict resolution skills, and enhance emotional intelligence. And an essential element to that, research would suggest that if we are going to try and change attitudes and behaviours in children and young people, then the use of role play and role reversal is extremely important. Children learn more from role play than any other way of learning. It shows itself to be highly effective in building empathy. So the game will enhance children and young people's capacity to see and to feel the impact of intimate personal violence through the eyes of others and build compassion towards each other. I do have some experience in using immersive interactive games. I'm currently using a game called Rosie 2, which was developed by Professor David Shemmings from the University of Kent. It is an immersive game that we use with qualified social workers, and it depicts a child protection issue. It shows many scenes of children living in a family home who have been sexually abused, who have been neglected, and where domestic abuse is inherent in the family. Social workers go through a number of different scenes, looking at how with the family, work on a one-to-one basis with the children, and they begin to reflect upon whether the approaches that are being used could be improved upon, and what theory and what knowledge underpins it. We have evaluated it quite robustly because it's the first time I have ever used an immersive, interactive, pro-social game. I have to tell you now, I have been absolutely stunned by the evaluation of this game. The social workers have responded to the characters within the game. They have been protective of the children. They have really been able to emotionally connect with the characters in a way that I could never attempt for them to do if I'd given them a case scenario on a sheet of paper. So much so that the people that we're working with and the local authorities that we are working with are wanting to invest year after year, and we are looking at ways in which we can perhaps get funding to develop our own games. I cannot state enough how important pro-social games are at beginning to change behaviours and to help professionals, not just children and young people, gain emotional intelligence. But the other thing, and lastly perhaps, that I want to state is that it's really important is that such a game that we are hopefully going to introduce has to connect to young people. It has to have relevancy, it has to have currency, and it has to mirror some of their experiences. So what we've wanted to do as a team is to consult with children and young people, and we had a phenomenal day yesterday where we met 30 or 40 young girls and young women, and around 10 to 15 young men. We held focus groups with them, asking them about their experience of what a healthy relationship was, but also some of their experiences of what an unhealthy relationship was, listening to their stories, listening to their experiences, and most importantly saying to them, if you were to play this game in a school and a college, what do you need to be in there? What would hold your attention? What would be powerful? What would be real? And they were absolutely phenomenal in being able to give us some real clues and ideas of what we should be putting in that game, which makes this even more exciting as a project, because it has to be owned by the children and young people of Barbados and Grenada. And I'm going to hand over to Dave, and he's going to be able to hopefully show us a little bit more about how that's going to happen. Thank you.
I would like to thank Jill for doing an excellent job of introducing the importance of pro-social games. So I'm going to get right into it. I'm going to briefly just talk about how violent games and pro-social games actually follow some similar behaviour patterns. And I'll get into that in just a moment. I'm also going to talk about some of the challenges that we face while making this sort of game. Because traditionally games are used for entertainment value, whereas we're aiming very much for an educational context, and some of the subject matter that we're dealing with is quite sensitive. So we have to be quite delicate with our approach and our implementation. I'll also talk a little bit about what it's like to develop a game on a shoestring budget. As you're aware, the None in Three project, it's been funded fantastically, but many large-scale video games, they have like hundreds of people, whereas we only have a couple, and then of course the brilliant research team that's been backing us up as part of this as well. And then I'm going to get into, lastly, I'm going to describe and show you a little bit of the game itself and the sort of progress that we've made while developing a prototype. And this is part of the prototype that was also shown yesterday, and it's going to be shown throughout the rest of the trip while we're out here. So when it comes down to it, games are in essence interactive feedback loops. What we do is, as players, as people who are actually participating with the game, we take actions within the context of that game, and the game will then respond to that input. So we provide an input, and then the game provides a feedback, and that is how things go. It's just a cycle, and you're just constantly responding to the different stimulus that is provided to you. Now, a lot of the games that are currently out there are based around violence, and because they are based around violence, the games expect you to take violent action. And then as you perform the violent actions in the game, that is how you progress, and then you are rewarded, be it with new levels, characters, perhaps the story then moves forward. In essence, you have to perform violent actions to then move on with the rest of the game. And what that means is we are effectively giving positive feedback for violent actions at times. And if you give positive feedback for a certain action enough times, it becomes a feedback loop. It becomes conditioning to an extent. But what I'd like to do is kind of turn this on its head a little bit and suggest, well, if we can use violent actions to create a feedback loop for violence, why can't we do the same thing for emotionally intelligent actions in a game? Why can't we reward players for trying to perform these emotionally intelligent actions instead? And if we do this enough times, we should end up with a much more positive feedback loop, and then hopefully that will encourage social change. One of the ways that we've been attempting to do this is not just through the means of the role-playing itself. We've added a little emotional intelligence indicator to the game. So during key moments, we would like to check, we would like people to try and self-identify how they're feeling in the current situation whilst they're playing the game. So at key moments, as emotions and situations unfold, this little prompt will appear in the corner, and what you can do is just very quickly pick your emotion, and that's going to encourage players to try and self-regulate and identify how they feel. Because generally speaking, some gamers can be quite passive in the way that they play games. They just take them at face value, and they never then reflect inwardly based upon what's actually happening in the game. They never try and apply it to themselves. They like to be taken for a ride, if you will. So the None in Three game then, as Jill's mentioned, is a game that's designed to educate young people about domestic violence. And what we're going to hope to do is roll this out to schools in Barbados and Grenada as part of their curriculum. We aren't going to take up too much of the class time, and we've been thinking quite well about the structure that we're going to take in terms of the game itself. We've been facing quite a few challenges as part of this. First and foremost is, how do we portray the impact of violence without directly showing violence to young people? When it comes down to it, we can't directly show certain scenes of violence to young people, especially those of, say, like 10 and 11 years old. That's just, it's a little bit on the nose, it's a bit irresponsible. I believe that maybe we just need to think about perhaps the impact and the factors that lead up to it, and then if people can identify those, perhaps that's a better way of dealing with it, instead of just trying to go for kind of that traditional blockbuster shock and awe approach that people use. And the other challenge that we face a lot is obviously the curriculum itself. Every school will obviously need to plan its lessons, and we need to make sure that the way that we implement the game into the schools is flexible, and it allows the schools to implement it in the way that it doesn't impact their curriculums too much. So to try and solve solution challenge 1, like I've just said, what we're going to do is, for the younger players, they'll only play through like the first section of the game, and this section will feature the violence happening off camera. That is to say, you won't actually see the violence occurring, because it's not necessarily what needs to be shown. Players don't need to necessarily encounter the violence itself. What we would like to do is educate how the factors leading up to violence, and then the things that can be done to perhaps escape from that violent situation. And the other one is, of course, how do we be flexible with the demands on the curriculum? So what we'll do is, kind of like in a workshop format, we'll create like a brief lesson plan, and the game will be broken down into chunks. And the teacher can introduce the core theme of whichever level, and levels, for those of you that don't know, are like the individual environments as part of a game. So each one is a different scene in a different time. And then what will happen is the students will then play at the computers for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, depending on the length of the level and the complexities involved in it. When everybody's done, the students can then come back in and go through a teacher-led discussion group. And what they can do is, led by the teacher, they can identify all the key issues that they encountered, and because it is a game and it's interactive, there'll be different choices, and through those choices the students can come together and realise that there were different ways out of those situations perhaps. And what we've tried to do is come up with kind of like a bite-sized structure, so each of those lessons can be planned around an individual level. So here are what we propose to be the first case of the game, and I'll get more into what each case is going to be specifically later on. But the first case is going to be broken up into approximately 5 levels, and each one is going to deal with a different theme. So in the first level, it's all about seeking out the information that you need right at that moment. So whereas I said the violence doesn't necessarily happen in that moment, the child of the victim will be the one who has to then seek help. So you must then go and find help, whether that's by running out into the street and finding someone who will help you, or calling an ambulance. Then in the second level, this is more to do with trying to provide the information that people just don't have day to day on hand. And we can use the game as a vehicle to provide people with the information, with the organisations that can help them. In the third level, we are actually going to look a lot more into the impact on the child themselves. So the child is obviously becoming a lot more withdrawn and starting to lash out a little bit due to the nature of the violence that's happening at home. And what you can then do is, through the means of the game, you can play with the child inside the game and try and get them to open up through the means of a board game that used to be, I found it as part of a social work project. So we decided to put a board game inside a game, so that's something. Level 4 then, so this is an interesting one. Not only does it impact obviously the family themselves and the people who are the victims and the child, but also how do friends and peers see themselves in that situation. So in this level, you would actually role play as a character who is the close friend of the perpetrator. And so what the goal there is to try and, convince them through the means of discussion that perhaps what they're doing is wrong. And you can choose the dialogue options and try and influence that outcome through like a rational debate. And it's all about trying to provide perspective. Like Jill said, a lot of the times we focus on just the victim and we forget about the perpetrator. So through this, we actually have the opportunity to examine the perpetrator's motives and reasons for doing what they think they're doing. And then finally, level 5 is trying to identify a way out of these situations. Now, obviously, that's not something that's easy to do, and we will be providing players with several options, and it's up to them to choose the one that they feel is right for them. And again, it's just about going back to level 2 and trying to give them information about the people that possibly they can turn to as well. So we are trying to use the game as a vehicle for information that has real-world value as well. So just to talk about some of the challenges that we're facing while making this game. Games have been very expensive to develop, and that's because they're interactive. They have all these different possibilities. Destiny cost $500 million, which is probably $500 million they could have spent on something much more useful, but never mind. Whereas in our budget, we only really have, in terms of staffing, the one game developer, hi, that's me, and one work package lead who unfortunately can't be here on this trip. And between us, we have to create the design of the game itself, so how you interact, and the programming, and the animation, and all these different things that are, all these little complicated things that have to come together to make a convincing experience. And also, there has been a rumor running around that we were going to provide devices to the schools. There is absolutely no money in the budget to face a very limited perspective of the characters in the game. The other thing, which I believe in very strongly, is that educational games are obviously all about the content and the themes. But I believe if you would like young people to connect with them, the games also have to be very convincing. All too often in serious games, they tend to not be as detailed in certain areas. So like perhaps they're missing animation, or the voice acting is just done by whoever was available at the time, and they didn't spend very long trying to get people. Now the problem with that is you end up with very flat wooden characters who don't really have very much emotional intensity, and if you're not feeling that emotional intensity while you're playing the game, there's only a certain amount of yourself that you can then put into it as well. So we're going to use motion capture in order to get convincing animations as part of that. We're also going to use facial capture, which is something that you can use a webcam on a laptop, and you can pull gestures into it, and it will map those directly onto the characters. And that's a great way of actually getting the subtleties that perhaps other games have missed in the past, and that includes educational games. And the end results are really quite promising. This here is a character called Rondell, who I'll go into in a moment, and you can see that he's clearly upset about something. Whereas, again, in the past, the most that a lot of educational games have done is they've perhaps lowered the eyebrows a little bit to go like, ooh, I'm cross. But we can do a lot more than that now that the technology has moved on a bit. Sometimes it doesn't always go to plan, and I end up with characters who look like they've been dislocated, but I fix these things and we move on. So what about this trip itself? It's actually been incredibly important that we come out here for several reasons. Not even the most important one, but it's actually quite important that I gather lots of visual reference for what the region actually looks like, because there's only so much that you can Google. If you Google Barbados, eventually you hit Rihanna, yeah? There's no two ways about it. It's impossible to avoid Rihanna while searching for anything. And good luck trying to find out what the inside of the average house looks like out here, because all the real estate companies have bumped their websites up. So you just end up with massive villas and things, and that's not representative of what we're trying to achieve. So actually coming out here has been so useful, because I get to see the things that Google lets you down as a research tool sometimes, and that's one of those situations. And also it's been great to get a better feel for life on the islands and a little bit of the subtleties. I am from England. I've never really travelled that much, and a lot of the dialogue that I've written earlier is quite wooden and English, and to be honest, I've had to stop myself a few times from writing down in the dialogue, the character pours a cup of tea and decides they want 2 sugars. And that's why it's so useful to come out here. I'm not saying you don't drink tea, I'm just saying we probably drink a little bit more than you. So, and then of course there's the real reason we're out here, which is meeting with the youth groups. And as Jill went into, it's been so useful to get their feedback, not just on the game prototype itself, but just how they feel about certain things that we're going to cover in later cases too. So as I'll mention in a moment, we actually are going to create a game, a second part of the game that is to do with social media and its impact on relationships, and that is so important for how adolescent people actually interact these days in just about every country in the world, and that applies to here as well. And the other reason is to find the voice actors. So as I mentioned earlier, if you just grab whoever's nearby and go, hey, you're a guy, this is a guy character, say these lines, you end up with, I can't believe you've done this. This is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. and it's just very flat and deadpan, and you just can't get any emotional intensity out of it. So we're really trying to put in a little bit of effort in getting actual intensity into that. So yeah, it's very important to bring those characters to life, and we are going to use the voices of the people out here. Lord knows you don't want me to try the accent. It will end in disaster. And if you are interested, so if anybody in this room is interested in being a voice actor in the game, if you want your voice to be a character in a game, get in touch with us, because we would love to have your voice. As long as we have a character and you can get into the zone, we'd love to have you in our game. So the game itself then, so we're going to set it in a fictional mix of Barbados and Grenada. We can't make two games, unfortunately. I wish we could, but there aren't two of me. There is, I've noticed while I was doing my research, a lack of representation in this region of the world. Video games set in the Caribbean, 6 of them apparently, according to Wikipedia. Not the most reliable source, but I've played a lot of games and I think that's pretty accurate. I was asking the focus groups yesterday what games had they heard of that represent their countries. They could name 3, yeah? There's a huge gap here, and I can't find any that specifically detail Barbados and Grenada, and I feel like that we're letting people down in terms of representation here. We have a great opportunity to make a game that is about this country and about Grenada, and I don't want to waste it. So that's why we're out here as well, to make it as detailed and as, I don't want to say homely, I don't know quite the word I'm looking for, accurate as possible. So yeah, we're going to tackle forms of violence for a role-playing game, and the way we're going to do that is players are going to be able to talk to other characters, they're going to be able to interact depending on the context. You're going to play as different characters, so perhaps you play as a nurse and you have to patch up the injuries of someone who has come in and has just been attacked. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we are focusing on the real experiences of people from the area. And the game is split into multiple cases, and there's a very good reason for that. As you're aware, there are multiple different kinds of violence, and we would like to tackle more than one. And so what we're going to do is focus on a different area of violence in each of these 3 cases, and we'll have a different set of characters for each one. And each of those also contains different levels and environments to explore as well. And what that's going to do is that's going to keep it fresh and interesting for the young people who are playing this game as well, because every time they'll get new characters and different environment and a different situation to deal with. So case 1 then, which is the one that we've been thinking about the most, because it's the one we're going to do first. It's about a mother and child who encounter domestic violence from the mother's partner. And what we're trying to focus on the most is how the mother and child deal with this stressful situation in different ways. So obviously the mother is concerned with trying to make sure that she can support herself and the child, and is wondering what are my options? Is there anything I can do to change the situation? And the child is becoming withdrawn and is trying to deal with it in their own way. We're also going to do this mostly from the child's point of view, this first case. And the reason for that is because we feel like if there's a young character in the game that you play as primarily, people will connect more with that young character. So I'm just going to talk briefly about a couple of the characters, just to give you an idea of where we're going and what the situations and contexts are. And you will recognise from some of the research where we've pulled in bits and bobs. So Diana is in a relationship with Rondell. And Rondell is the abusive partner, and obviously Diana is currently pregnant with Rondell's baby. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as just going, I've had enough, and walking away, as indeed it never is, but especially because Diana has recently just lost her job, and that now makes her dependent on Rondell for both her and her child, and her unborn child. Then you have Rondell himself, so he's a telephone repairman. And obviously Diana and the child move in with him, but he's quick to anger, especially after a drinking session. So the child, we've yet to name the child. We're actually, just to get a bit of back and forth going in these focus groups, we have put it out to a vote between a list of gender neutral names, because we're still debating whether or not you'll be able to play as a boy or a girl, depending, because what we found is that people seem to in the focus groups yesterday, people were wondering, the boys especially, oh well, can we play as a boy? and can we change what the boy looks like? And so with the girls, they were like, oh, can we change the hair? Because if you connect a little bit more with that character, well, there you go, you connect a bit more. And again, as we mentioned, you don't necessarily see the violence, but it is taking place, and we're dealing with the aftermath of that, really. And the child's becoming more withdrawn, which ties a lot into the research in the previous talk as well. And there's a cast of supporting characters, and they're all there just to offer a different lens through which to view the main three characters. Is this working? Yeah, okay. So here's a little bit of prototype footage. We haven't really got much of the art in there yet. But as you can see, you can kind of walk around, you can have conversations with people, you can interact with certain elements. You can see some of our animation at work as well. You can do things like open doors and drawers, and you can try and find things. And then obviously that's the situation that's at hand. So they're both home and they're about to have an argument, but you have to make your decision. Do you go back and get the homework, or do you try and hide in your room? And we've got a variety of environments as well, and that's again why I'm really pleased to be out here, because again, Google lets you down. There's precious few photographs of hospitals out here, but I found plenty of pool halls, so I've got that covered. Cases 2 and 3 are a little different. Case 2, as Jill was mentioning, is going to deal with adolescent relationships, and especially the way that social media influences them, because I wouldn't say it's everything, we still do communicate face-to-face, and young people do that, but it's an instant form of communication, and there's a lot of bullying and negative perceptions that go about on social media, and it will be interesting to try and tackle that in the form of a game. Because what that allows people to do, it gives them a safe space to try and respond on a fake social network, and then they can, get the answers back and go, maybe I should handle things differently with my own personal social networking. And then case 3 is a bit more of a challenge. It deals with arguably an even more sensitive matter, which is sexual violence. We will not be aiming that at the younger age groups of the project, and that is for obvious reasons, because it contains sexual violence instead. We're also considering all platforms, just to keep options open. So here you see I've actually got the game working on my mobile phone, and here's the conversation system, so you can see how you can then choose different dialogue options. And it's not limited to yes and no, you can choose from a wide variety. So anyway, I've actually rambled on a little bit longer than I was supposed to. So I'll just briefly recap. We're hoping to encourage emotional intelligence and pro-social behaviour through the means of a game. We're going to try and be really smart with the technology and the budget to provide as authentic and realistic as an experience as we can. And I've given you an overview of where we're at with the prototype so far. And thanks to the feedback that we've had in the past day or so, and indeed over the rest of the trip, we're definitely going to go back to the drawing board a little bit and make sure that the game is something that they definitely are going to be engaged with playing. So thank you very much, and do you have any questions?